It was a destructive and costly battle as both sides used ever more sophisticated weapons and tactics. In Rolling Thunder, American aircraft dropped over 650,000 tons of bombs on North Vietnam. There were also massive operations in South Vietnam, supporting American ground troops and against communist supply lines and bases in Laos and Cambodia. The air war in Southeast Asia was more than a contest between the United States and North Vietnam. From the start, America's Cold War enemies, China and the Soviet Union, were backing the North with weapons, advisors, and support personnel. For U.S. leaders, that raised the most difficult question they had ever faced. Could the air war be won without sparking off a wider and infinitely more dangerous conflict? The United States Air Force began its war in Southeast Asia more than 3 years before American combat troops set foot in Vietnam. In late 1961, President John F. Kennedy ordered more help for the South Vietnamese government in its war against the Viet Cong guerrillas. U.S. backing included new equipment and more than 3,000 military advisors and support personnel. Soon, U.S. Army and Marine helicopters were flying South Vietnamese government soldiers and their American advisors into combat against the Viet Cong. U.S. Air Force transport planes helped with troop deployments and supplies. Meanwhile, reconnaissance aircraft searched for guerrilla units, and interceptors defended South Vietnamese airspace against North Vietnamese or even possibly Soviet or Chinese intruders. Amongst the first U.S. Air Force units sent to Vietnam was a small detachment of helicopters disguised in South Vietnamese markings. Under special rules of engagement, codenamed Farmgate, the aircraft were flown by U.S. personnel, but had to have a South Vietnamese Air Force officer on board. Unofficially, they were flying combat missions against the NLF. In spite of American efforts, the NLF inflicted a series of defeats on the South Vietnamese Army in 1963. Guerrilla numbers were rising, and they were better armed and led than ever. With each month that passed, the NLF was getting more weapons, ammunition, and trained men from North Vietnam. The main supply route from North Vietnam, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, ran inside Laos and Cambodia to the NLF's base areas in the south. The trail was manned by North Vietnamese army troops with the help of Laotian guerrillas who were waging their own war against the Lao government. The NLF guerrillas were concentrated in the Mekong Delta, around Saigon, and in the central and northern parts of Vietnam. It was near these areas that the Americans stationed helicopter companies to carry South Vietnamese troops into battle. The detachment operating under Farmgate was based at Ben Hua near Saigon, and there was another important base at Tan Son Nhut. 3 smaller airfields also supported fixed-wing operations. By the end of 1963, Farmgate pilots, soon known as Air Commandos, were flying more than 80 missions a week. They attacked Viet Cong base areas and river traffic, and were credited with killing hundreds, maybe thousands of guerrillas. Operation Ranch Hand flights, spraying a deadly herbicide to destroy jungle cover, were also flown under Farmgate rules. The spraying, which began in early 1962, cleared the vegetation alongside highways. Viet Cong ambushes would then be far easier to spot. Ranch Hand's mission was soon extended beyond preventing ambushes. Vast tracts of forest were sprayed with Agent Orange, a herbicide containing the deadly chemical dioxin. Guerrilla trails and base areas were exposed, and crops that might feed Viet Cong units were destroyed. By the summer of 1971, Operation Ranch Hand had sprayed 11 million gallons of Agent Orange, containing 240 pounds of dioxin, and destroyed 6 million acres of South Vietnam. 1/7 of the country's total area was laid waste. Herbicides containing dioxin were banned for use in the U.S. by the Department of Agriculture in 1968. In Vietnam, the spraying continued until 1971. Between April and June 1964, American air power in Southeast Asia was massively reinforced. 2 aircraft carriers arrived off the Vietnamese coast. The move was prompted by an NVA offensive in Laos. To help Laotian government forces, U.S. aircraft mounted a big reconnaissance effort, codenamed Operation Yankee Team. Soon after Yankee Team began, 2 Navy planes were lost to anti-aircraft fire over Laos. The Air Force retaliated by hitting the enemy gun positions in the first jet bombing raids in Southeast Asia. As well as photographing the activities of the Laotian guerrillas, American aircraft over Laos were monitoring the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was clear that North Vietnam was sending more men and supplies to the southern guerrillas than ever before. In Washington, the new U.S. President, Lyndon Johnson, was being pressed hard by his military commanders to punish the North. So far, Johnson had refused to sanction official direct attacks on North Vietnam. However, covert attacks were being conducted over Vietnam near the Laotian border. It was an incident in the Tonkin Gulf that finally lit the fuse. In bad weather conditions, the captain of an American destroyer thought he was fired upon by North Vietnamese patrol boats, an attack that actually never happened. But on August 5, 1964, the president ordered retaliation. Operation Pierce Arrow was launched by the carriers Ticonderoga and Constellation. Aircraft from Constellation bombed North Vietnamese naval facilities at Hong Gai and Loc Chau, with the loss of 2 American aircraft. Fuel storage tanks and a patrol boat base at Vinh and another base at Quang Cay were attacked by aircraft from Ticonderoga. Later, a follow-up strike completed the devastation at Vinh. In North Vietnam, the American bombing raids immediately triggered a secret plan. For years, the North had been creating an air force with Soviet-built jet fighters. The force had been based in China. The day after the American bombings, the fighters were called home. Even as the North Vietnamese fighters began to patrol out of their new base, the Americans rushed their own reinforcements to the region. The Air Force deployed more than 70 planes to Vietnam and Thailand. The Navy sent 2 more carriers steaming towards the Gulf of Tonkin. As tension in Southeast Asia rose sharply, U.S. intelligence learned of an ominous development. In October 1964, China, Vietnam's neighbor and ally, successfully tested an atomic bomb. In Southeast Asia, the aim was to find and destroy North Vietnamese transport and installations on the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos. For the Americans, Operation Barrel Roll was the start of an attempt to cut off supplies to the NLF that would last for a full 8 years. By February 8, 1965, NLF guerrillas in South Vietnam had launched a series of attacks on U.S. installations and personnel. Carrier aircraft had been kept ready to retaliate if the president gave the order. On February 7, 1965, they were unleashed against North Vietnamese targets. Operation Flaming Dart was launched from the carriers Ranger, Hancock, and Coral Sea, and from airfields in South Vietnam by both U.S. and South Vietnamese planes. The targets were North Vietnamese Army barracks and the 325th Infantry Division's training base at Dong Hoi. Because of bad weather, only one target was hit in strength, at the cost of an aircraft shot down. In the next 5 days, more retaliation raids again hit Army barracks. 3 American aircraft were lost. Up to now, the American airstrikes on the north had been in retaliation for particular incidents. However, many in Washington believed that bombing should have a much bigger role to play. They argued a sustained campaign of attacks could make North Vietnam stop supporting the war in the South. Military planners had long ago been given permission to prepare a major bombing offensive. It was codenamed Operation Rolling Thunder. On February 13, 1965, the White House gave the go-ahead. 2 weeks later, on March 2nd, after a series of delays, the Americans launched the first raid of the new campaign. The initial plan was to launch 2 or 3 strikes every week. But by March 19th, with Rolling Thunder 7, the airstrikes became a sustained and regular effort. Rolling Thunder got off to an uncertain start. The first mission, flown by more than 100 aircraft, hit an ammunition dump in the Quang Ke Naval Base. 5 U.S. aircraft were lost. In the following weeks, North Vietnamese radar, railway bridges, and military bases were attacked, but more American aircraft were shot down. Already, it looked like an air war over North Vietnam might prove far more costly than anyone had expected.